murder most power.
I use associated with Mara. Yeah, so you will
It's already recorded.
Serious.
Right.
Good
afternoon. Welcome to the third round of UKM IV 14. So, opening government have here in the US, opening up the university in the UK, closing government in MRA, closing position in UKM IV. So, motion which I can remember as that wording. Let's talk on first speaker.
May it please the House. On the motion that this House would impose a maximum rent on residential populations in urban areas, I'm proud to propose the motion. I'm going to begin by talking about what specifically the government believes is a model that we should use to implement such a motion. We believe that we should create a system that allows for that creates a price cap, price ceiling in economic terms on the amount of rent that landlords can charge. We don't believe that we should be making a system where landlords are forced to rent their properties at a loss. We don't believe that that's a system that's economically sustainable, and that's not what the government's advocating for. What we want to do is talk about whether or not this type of system of a price ceiling is, on a normative level, beneficial for society on a governmental perspective. We as the government believe that it is beneficial for us on a principled level and a practical level to adopt this policy in order to help create social mobility. So I'm going to first begin by characterizing the problem before moving on to my substantive. So let's look at what we have in the status quo and why this policy is needed. So first, I'm going to talk to you about what the economic status quo looks like, and I'm going to give you four characterizations. So first is that people in areas coming. They're moving and migrating from rural areas all across the world into the urban center in an attempt to find employment and to make themselves money. Now, some of them do remit money back to the rural areas. Others simply try and live paycheck to paycheck in the urban area as a means of trying to achieve economic stability. Second characterization is that the city center is where the vast majority of work that people are looking for is. We see that a large majority of both service and production sectors are happening nowadays in the city center all across the world, whether it be Southeast Asia, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in the Americas. When we look at this regardless, we see that this issue is that the city center, quite simply put, is important. The people need to be able to have access to the city center to find work, which leads to the third characterization, which is that people are unable to find work unless they go to the city center. Since the city center contains such a large portion of work, we need people to have access to the city center to gain access to work. And then the fourth characterization is that as a result of this, there is an influx of people who want to come in, and landlords are able to jack up the prices for rent in the urban center. Because there is a high amount of demand, and because housing is an inelastic good, because people have to go to the city center in order to be able to gain the money that they need to work, therefore people are going to, landlords are able to jack up the price higher than would fit normal economic conditions. So what do we see as a result of this status quo? We see that right now the poor are disadvantaged because they are unable to find housing in an acceptable way. And as a result of this, we're going to see my two substantives today. I'm going to talk about why this policy would help social development on the governmental perspective, and that the benefits of this policy outweigh the harms. And second, I'm going to talk about why specifically this implementation of this policy works in achieving the social aims that I'll talk about first. So let's talk about social development. I'm going to bring you five main ideas on social development today. The first is that the inner city crushes down people financially in the status quo. What we see is that landlords have the ability, as I talked about before, to jack up prices. And as a result of the increased cost of material goods that happen as a result of transportation and all kinds of other issues within the inner city, people are often forced to live paycheck to paycheck. And that has several impacts. My second reason. First is that this ends up harming education all across the world. This can be seen most evidently in sub-Saharan Africa. When you have people who are being forced into the inner city, they have to go to the city and they work paycheck to paycheck. And when you have simply put people trying to find housing as a way to sustain their economic livelihood, you see that oftentimes people end up dropping out of school. Parents pressure their children to not pursue education, not because that's what they want them to do in the long term economically, but because it's what they need to survive. Go ahead.
That being illegal in most countries?
No, actually, it's not illegal in those countries. I'm not going to be Amerocentric, even though I'm an American, and just talk about the minimum labor laws that exist in the developed Western world. I'm talking about all countries, developing countries and developed countries. I believe that urban development is something that needs to be sustainable on a worldwide initiative. And I think that regardless, we're talking about this on a normative level. I think that that's something that's important when we're talking about this issue. Now, the third reason is that this would increase crime. When you have these people put into the inner city without economic sustainability, you have an increased amount of crime. There's been substantial sociological evidence documenting the fact you see increased amount of drug use, you see increased prostitution, you see increased amounts of black market trades as a result of the inner city coming together and people being unable to escape from the cycles of poverty. And the next reason being that as a result of people having to live paycheck to paycheck, they aren't able to engage in civil society actively. Because they've been oppressed in this way, they can't interact governmentally appropriately, and that means that their ability to function as part of the civil democratic society unit is hampered. And Benji will talk to you more about this in his substantive. And finally, is that it means that the poor see the government as something that is adverse to their interests. What we end up seeing as a result of the status quo is that the poor see the government and the rich as allowing landlords to abuse them by jacking up the prices as much as they possibly can. And it creates a perception that means that the poor are unwilling to trust the government, they're unwilling to interact with the government and society, and they're unwilling to benefit from these interactions. So we've seen a clear picture portrayed of what the problems are in the status quo, not just in the developed world, but in the developing world. So how would this problem fix the solution in both of these circumstances? And I'm going to provide this to you right now. So first, no, thank you. So when we're talking about why this is the proper solution, we need to characterize it first into developing world and second into the developed world. I'm going to talk about the developed world first. In the developed world, in cities such as New York or Chicago or London, you need to have decreased prices because the service industry that exists in those segments is primarily what people are going for. People are going there to work in the financial industry, they're going there to work in restaurants, they're going there to work as the person who sells the newspaper on the subway. Why do these people need less price of housing? They need a lower price of housing so they can achieve these economic realities that you can only find in the status quo in developed nations within the inner city. You can only find these kind of opportunities for personal development, the ability to get out of poverty, the ability to have social mobility within the city. So in the developing world, that's clearly important. Now, in the developed world, now in the developing world, this solution is better because when we see this cap on prices, we see that we create a more sustainable initiative to create sustainable growth. Now, New York and Chicago have already totally fucked up their urban planning. They did that several hundred years ago. But now, as we're seeing new emerging cities, we have the ability to change this and to make it more beneficial into the future. If we impose a cap, we create an economic incentive for landlords and governments to create a system that allows for sustainable housing that protects both the interests of the poor and the middle class and the rich. What we see is that both in the context of the developing world and in the context of the developed world, creating a cap, preventing landlords from jacking up prices, as I talked about before, is the way that we can see these benefits. It can increase education, it can decrease crime, and it can strengthen the ability of the city as an institution to function both in the short term and in the long term. It's because the government stands for development, it's because the government stands for economic sufficiency that we stand proudly in proponents of the motion.
Right, thank you very much. I call upon the speaker opening opposition.
Sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you.
What's that?
Yeah, it's okay.
Oh, it's right about last time.
Mr. Speaker, we think when it comes to protectionism and regulation as to whether or not how a market functions, we think that A, this doesn't apply in this scenario, given the lack of need, which is something I'll definitely speak about. But secondly, we think that even then, Mr. Speaker, we think government intervention, when it is not justified, harms the economy in this sense, and it harms the individual who owns the property to begin with. Therefore, we think it is unjustified and unjust. But I have a few responses, right, to the case of opening government. Okay, firstly, they want to talk about the social harms brought about by crime. I question their logic by when they attribute social harms such as crime, such as poverty, to urban price rates of housing. Now, that is a problem. We don't understand why that happens because, Mr. Speaker, I can give you a lot of responses as to why these things happen, such as like poor enforcement and other attributes normally associated with urban areas to begin with, such as like the influx the lesser likelihood of law enforcement. Firstly, secondly, like the reduction on the ability to enforce the law as a whole, and like all other factors, Mr. Speaker. We think that for those reasons, we think that this idea of crime, the attribution of crime to property prices is not accurate to begin with. But secondly, on this idea of social development and how that better happens, this whole paycheck to paycheck living, right, Mr. Speaker, we think, this is where we come in, right? We think that no, it's not about. We don't think this targets the group of people that they speak of, because it's not about the poor, Mr. Speaker. Here's why. Because if it were really about the poor, we tell you that it doesn't affect their livelihood, the way they live their lives, because the poor can simply stay in a suburban area and travel. We are fine with that. It's not a necessity, Mr. Speaker, that they have to stay in the city and live in the city in order to get a job in the city and generate their livelihood there. We don't think that's the right thing to say. No, thank you, not yet, right? Okay, but lastly, we question their characterization, because like I told you, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that the poor have to live there, and that results in all the social harms we talk about, because they try to attribute the social harms to poor people in general. We don't think that's accurate to begin firstly. But secondly, even if it were true, Mr. Speaker, just a minute, right? Even then, we think that there's no dire necessity for anyone to stay in the residential area given the amount of, like, say, connectivity that we have in status quo. But even if it were necessary, Mr. Speaker, these things are already adequately provided for by the companies who are aware of these maximum, the high prices which are present in status quo. That is why, Mr. Speaker, it is very rare, and even it is rare for a company to subsidize all the, but even then, it is only when it is necessary and accommodation is provided for. That is why we tell you that the solution is already taken care of in status quo. But before that, I'll take a few ones. Anyway.
Okay, so you're basically saying right now that companies are trying to provide a break-even point, right? So people are basically going to be living paycheck to paycheck under that characterization you just provided, right? Because if they're providing just enough for people to get by, that creates the same kind of characterization we just talked about, right? Doesn't it?
No, we don't think so, because it's actually really, like, let's put it this way, Mr. Speaker. Maybe I wasn't being clear enough. I'll be very clear now, right? So if you cannot afford to stay there, don't stay there. Stay somewhere where it's affordable and you find adequate means to travel to work. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we see people moving to suburban areas, people stay there and they commute to work every day. We tell you that's status quo, and we are totally fine with that. We don't think it creates the kind of scenario that they want to portray. No, thank you. Not yet, right? Okay, firstly, principle level, why in this sense is it unjustified? We think it's only fair to let the market forces work, Mr. Speaker, especially when it comes to real estate, because where the market forces like supply and demand come together to shape the market, shape the real estate field, we think that protectionism is not justified here. Why? Because we tell you in status quo, the government only applies protectionism when it needs to protect like the lower classes and the lower middle classes. How is this so? Because we think that like, for example, like when we talk about things like, no, thank you, sir. When we talk about things like, say, maximum price levels for things like sugar, like for things like rice, we think these are absolute basic necessities where there is no alternative, Mr. Speaker. And that is something that they seem to run on the assumption that there is an alternative. No, there is no alternative. We tell you there is an alternative. We justify how necessary and how important it is, like for an alternative to be present. That's why the government shouldn't do it, right? But secondly, this doesn't occur, Mr. Speaker, because why? Because we think that this debate will be naturally about the access of this to the people who, like the middle class, right? Whether or not they should buy, how this impacts the housing market to them, and their ability to buy that property to begin with. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, on a principle level, regulation to restrict market forces in that respect. But let's talk about the harms, tangible harms to the landlords, right? Not yet, right? The tangible harms to the landlords. Firstly, we tell you they suffer a loss in revenue. Why? Because given that most of them are going to purchase this property with the intention of renting it out, Mr. Speaker, and this is harmful on several levels. Like firstly, they always use it to sustain their mortgage to begin with, right, Mr. Speaker? Secondly, most of the people who own it, pre-existing owners now, are going to lose out on revenue they could otherwise gain by virtue of owning property and by virtue of the property gaining value. And we think that's principally unfair for the government to step in and meddle with this income, given that it is totally legitimate, and given that it is present in all other areas of society except this, and they already own it, right? Even that it was not expensive when they did. So what does this mean? This means that you harm their livelihood. Why do I say this? I say this because, Mr. Speaker, there's a huge amount of people in status quo who survive like as retirement, right? They keep they generate revenue through the renting out of these properties. And what do you mean? So when you impose a maximum rent, that's not the only harm, Mr. Speaker, because then it's easy for them to come up and say, well, obviously the maximum rent won't be so high, therefore the harms will not be so great. But we think this, these people are less likely to be able to afford the mortgage which they took to buy these properties in the first place. What are the harms of this? This means two things, Mr. Speaker. This means A, the economy as a whole suffers on a macroeconomic scale, but secondly, the individual is likely to not be able to afford the mortgage after a while, given given that the mortgage paid, assuming that the person buys it, right, the mortgage paid and the rent received will not be enough to cover. So what does this mean? This means that eventually the person would have to give up, most probably have to give up property, and this leads to a host of harms, some of which I'll talk to you now. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, the value of the land will fall. Why is this unfair? We think that if the pre-existing owner wants to sell the property, we then think that the person will be taking a loss, because the market will react to the lack of investment opportunity available in these places now, given that less revenue can be generated with the same residential unit. But secondly, this is bad to existing house owners, because the mortgage they are paying now is disproportionate to the value of the property that they're having. This means that they're less likely to be able to afford these things to begin with, but also it means that they'll be paying more mortgage for a piece of property which isn't valued that much, because the state is stepping in. But what does this mean to future house buyers, Mr. Speaker? This is where we go to macroeconomics here, right? We think that this means that the less likelihood of buying and selling these properties due to insufficient prices causes a lag in demand, right? So clearly this means price level fall, something Claudine will speak to you about. So why does this happen? On a tangible level, we think that the housing market will eventually seep into a period of recession, and what this ultimately means is that you have a very weak housing market. You have a situation where aggregate demand is extremely low, and we think that this is bad for the country and the state as a whole, because given the harm that it poses to the individual and the state, we think that for all those reasons we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. That's all for one second.
Opening opposition's perspective is precisely the problem we have today. They tell us that there is no problem. The problem doesn't exist. They say if poor people can't afford to stay in the city, then they should just get out and try to find transport into the city for work, because that's evidently something that everyone can do regardless of income, right? They focus on the landlords versus the poor and talk about poor landlords, not cognizant of the fact that these landlords have been systematically ripping off people who have to stay in urban city centers, right? They haven't done a comparison of even if landlords' interests are to be protected, at what cost. So I will be talking about two main rebuttals today. Firstly, on the idea that there's a lack of need for this particular policy, right? And leader of opposition came out and told us, oh, there's no such need. Well, evidently they have not been listening to Jay, because Jay spent a full 5 to 6 minutes telling you why there's a need. Who are the people who are most affected by a policy of residential properties in urban centers? Clearly, it's people who live in residential properties in urban centers, right? And we have shown you why. Mostly, for example, in Chicago's inner city, they are populated not by rich white people, but by poor people who are coming in, who are trying to make a living in the city, right? Typically, inner city slums exist because people have to go there to work, right? Now, they say, oh, why can't they just stay in suburban areas and take a cab to work every single day? One, they can't afford it. Two, because yes, they can't afford it. That's why they're considered the poor, right? Next, the thing is that there's a high substitutability between these kind of low paid wages. So basically, this means that if you're not in the city and if I can't find you fast enough, then you just simply don't get the job, right? Someone else can equally do the job as well as you. And that's a very real problem they face, something openly completely neglects, right? We talked about oh, why don't you just stay in the suburban areas? Because they don't have the choice, they don't have the privilege that we have, that I can choose to stay in Singapore. Jay can choose to come from America to Singapore. We can choose to stay wherever you want in Selangor or KL, right? But these people don't get the choice. It's absolutely condescending of opening opposition to tell us that the problem doesn't exist. Next, they tell us that government intervention is always wrong and we should let the market forces do their work. No, because the end goal of any society is not to achieve total market efficiency, right? The end goal of society is to achieve an equitable distribution of goods and services to the entire society. If the invisible hand is what they want to go by, the invisible hand is perfect at distributing things like, according to who can pay, right? You need the plutocratic domination. But that's why in today's status quo, government steps in and redistributes goods, right? That's why we have welfare. And in fact, if they really wanted to go the whole for pure economic sort of thing, there will be no such thing as street lamps or no such thing as a police force, because no one is willing to pay for this kind of so-called social goods, right? It's an entire branch of economics. Look it up. And they talked about these poor landlords, they aren't going to make any profit. One, they ignore what Jay came out to say, that we will still be charging a reasonable price, that they still can reap reasonable profits. But two, they neglected what we talked about, the status quo, right? These landlords aren't honest people trying to make a living. They are deliberately there, systematically ripping off the poor because these poor have nowhere else to go. Even if we agree to everything leader of opposition say, what does that leave us with? It leaves us with landlords' interests are important and we should protect them. Okay, let's run with that. But will you allow landlords' interests to be protected at the expense of the rest of society? Right? And he says, it's worse for the housing market because prices will fall, landlords can't make their rent, things like that. But that's not true, right? In fact, it's even worse on your side, because what you do is you force people to take out subprime loans in order to get those mortgages, in order to get those rents. And that's exactly what happened in 2008, right? When the entire market crashed. When you force people to resort to these banks to get this kind of loans, and then they can't pay back these loans, that's when the market crashes, not just in the US, not just in that particular city or that country, but globally, right? That's how you bring down an entire market. Thank you, opening opposition. Anyway, the point is that if they're talking about real estate prices that affect primarily the middle class of investors, the middle class don't stay in the inner city slums. So even if I agree with everything on that, middle class people don't buy these kind of residential areas in urban city centers. So that point is completely moot. Having dealt with the entire opening opposition speech, let me move on to my additional substantive today. And Jay's point still stands, by the way, because I have no idea what they were trying to prove, the entirety of LO. I'm going to talk to you about how this engenders political awakening and how this is the best and most straightforward policy to do so. In status quo, we recognize that in countries with optional voting, these people who are present in the urban city centers usually don't vote. In the US presidential and midterm elections recently, it's disproportionately the college graduates and those with high pay that turn out to vote in the end, right? Blacks and Hispanics have traditionally been underrepresented in these kind of election turnouts, even under Obama, right? Why is this so? Two reasons. Firstly, is disillusionment with government practices, because these people, they see that they're not being protected, they're getting ripped off daily, and it's stuck in their face that the government isn't doing much to help them, right? This leads to a disillusionment not with the Democratic candidate, not with the Republican candidate, but with the electoral system as a whole, with society as a whole. And that's something that's very pernicious, that's something that's very insidious, because this separates them from the rest of society. This makes them feel that they don't belong to the rest of society. Go.
You do realize that city centers only have a limited amount of space anyway. So what's the issue if you cannot cater to everyone else? They will also get disillusioned.
We recognize that under any scenario, there are going to be some people who aren't going to be able to live at the city centers. But the question now is that when these people want to live in the city centers, do they pay an arm and a leg in order to live there? We agree that there's such thing as a reasonable price. We think that the status quo is not where you find the reasonable price, right? Next, we talk about economic poverty, because like when Jay said, you live from paycheck to paycheck, politics and the long-term future of the country is usually the last thing on your mind. And it's hard to get the proper checks and balances to leave your job in order to go and vote, because one, you lose money that you could otherwise have earned, and two, these jobs are usually informal and don't have that kind of practices that encourage people to go on and vote, right? Why is this bad? Because this goes against the entire point of democracy when you're supposed to have a representative government. Even under compulsory voting, when you're not able to consider politics as something that's essentially important, we say that that goes against the spirit of what a representative government should be. So why do we solve this? Because we recognize that economic instability is at the core, it's one of the main issues that is causing this kind of neglect, right? We send a social message to everyone and say look, the government is doing something, the government is taking care of you, we welcome back into the full society, you are an equal and respected member of society, even though you're of a lower socio-economic class. That's something that we have to fundamentally recognize. Sure, there may be other policies and we are welcome to go with it. But the thing is that this policy is a straightforward and a vitally important way to help the poor in today's society. We propose.
Right, thank you very much. Just call 1 second to give you a
Mr. Speaker, we think that if you have the capacity to work in, say, a good earning job and you have a merit, that means if you are an individual who have the ability to work in a workforce, people hire you because of merits and not where you stay. Because in a situation where you are fitting and the company deems you an individual who can do the task well and work here, most often at times, if you do not stay within the area, what the company does is provide you with accommodation. So is equality and access a problem? We don't particularly think so on three levels, right? Firstly, because companies already provide you with accommodation when you cannot afford it. No, when we think that you can and have the capacity to work and you are deemed capable. Second response is we already do that because we commute and we have transportation thing for you to commute if you want to say work in those circumstances in, say, a more urban area. So capacity and capability for you to get a job is not discrimination per se, right? No, thank you. Sit down, right? But they also told you this. They told you because individuals have to take up loans that they cannot afford and they cannot pay up, that's bad and that's a social problem. We don't think that this is true. And the debate and the characterization that they wanted to take was the poor. We don't think that's a fair characterization because most individuals that want or cannot afford in urban areas are going to be your middle class individuals at the very end of the day, right? But more importantly, why are loans? Then don't take out a loan or don't take out property that is hard for you to pay and you don't have the capacity to pay back, right? Individuals who take out loans are people who have good jobs and can afford to pay back those loans, right? The debate is not just about the poor at the end of the day, but they wanted to talk to you about discrimination as well as how like people will lead into crimes and all these things. We don't think that discrimination is due to things like this, like just because like property is not a social good at the very end of the day, right? Because discrimination occurs because people are racist, you have racist policies, you have things like Michael Brown. These things are discrimination. So you want better representation of Hispanic individuals, you impose a quota or things like that, right? Those can be eradicated. But more importantly, he also wanted to tell you how we're ripping individuals off. The thing is, because it's particularly important when you're debating about property, right? The proportion, we charge you in accordance in proportion to the value of the area. That means if there are universities in that area, we charge you higher. That means if there are shopping malls, there is better premium, there is better safety, we charge you not rip you up. But the second response to that is that we think that we're already an inherent competition within status quo to ensure those problems don't happen, right? But last rebuttal is in terms of crime, right? We think that the lack of education and the systemic problem of individuals not being able to, so even if you make it more affordable, people will still opt into, say, prostitution. It's not going to stop your crimes that will be happening. In fact, you make it more accessible because they can afford it even better. Before I move on to my substantive, Jazz.
Ensuring that there are balance of individuals from different economical class in a financial district where they all can access equal opportunities is a social good. How can you ensure that on your side?
Okay, because first of all, it's proportionate. That means these individuals who work and have a high earning job is able to contribute back on a larger scale. That's why they have the ability. But we also tell you that the rich will always be able to afford. That means even if you make it more affordable, that doesn't mean that the rich rich, that also means that the rich can afford to buy more property in those instances. And if I am a working company, I will buy even more property to hire individuals who can. No, thank you, right? But on my substantive too, I'll go through this fast, right? Firstly, the harms of aggregate demand, right? What does this mean? This means that real estate, because real estate in status quo takes up a large amount of revenue in status quo, right? In terms of taxation, that means individuals that take up the loans that they want to talk about are at the end of this argument. I'm going to conclude how this helps the poor and the disproportionate that you want to protect, right? Because when people take up loans, take up interest that goes into your taxation, that means the circulation of money is confirmed and it will always continue, right? The assets will not be freezed, right? People who can afford it will buy those things. That means there will be a continuous individuals who will be taxed because they can afford these things, right? Taxation and circulation in terms of income is a necessity in generating and increasing the value of your money. But what does this mean? The people that you want to protect at the end of the day, that taxation from this property and these things and the loans that people and say, i.e. putting the money in the education sector or putting the money in healthcare. Those are the people that we need to allocate most funds to, and this is the best capacity to do so, right? We think that we fix or this is the best way of a systemic problem, but the problem is under their policy is that you don't have the best capacity. That means you cannot tax at a rate in which will help the lowest common denominator because you cannot afford it, because now people will not have the ability to reach those avenues, right? So we think that the circulation of cash is ensured, right? But more importantly, if you look at 9/11, post 9/11 in America, right? How the credit market freeze in terms of its stock market because houses didn't have the ability to do so. We think that got down. But what's more important? We think that the rich has a right to this exclusivity, pay for protection. They pay for a gated community because they want their kids to grow up in a place that is secure, will attract educated people that have less criminal possibilities, right? We think the right to that protection is important, and the people who can afford that right should be granted those capacity to protect their individuals and protect those people, right? We think that because they work into being able to be at that status or that social strata, it shouldn't be taken away, right? Because your policy, right? Gated communities won't exist, or there will not be an incentive to provide better healthcare, better property, landed property in terms of how clean it is, how protected it is. But the exclusivity for rich people who can afford it will be achieved under our policy, even if it's by virtue of birth lottery. We think that under status quo, they're working for it and they have the capacity to pay back. But at the very end of the day, that money is going to be circulated for the people that you want to protect, and you cannot, because the systemic problems that they wanted to argue will still be prevalent even though property rates go lower.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. First speaker of closing government.
Site-closing government believes that there is an inherent need for us to impose a maximum rent because we reject the characterization of or understanding of opening opposition that there is no real or substantial problem. We bring to you two real problems. Number one, we believe all around the world that you have scarcity of space and land that can be utilized for all individuals within all income brackets. B, we also think that when you don't have this policy, social inclusivity it will not be achieved by states, right? But a clarification from closing government. We don't think that rent is method individuals that are landlords who necessarily buy and rent out these places. We also think that rents, especially within developed nations, are set by development companies that buy up property and set out rents and give it out to individuals as just as just an exclusive rent-only place, right? We think that these things can happen as well. What will we talk about from side closing government? What? We think that the state has a responsibility to implement this model because the state created the vacuum of economic access to these individuals. B, we'll also talk about why we need to limit the ability for you to distinguish classes and race by the location of where you stay and other economic things that I will talk about later, right? But firstly, a few rebuttals that don't necessarily fit in. We think it's inherently problematic for side opening opposition to say, if you can't afford to live in a city, then just get out, right? Because we think that, of course, some individuals can necessarily stay in suburban areas and they can commute and take the train and make the right cost-benefit analysis in terms of what are we willing to trade off in terms of going to our jobs. Some people can afford the train back and forth. For example, when you go in the United Kingdom, right, train tickets are designated by the zones that you're going to. The more central the zone is, the more expensive tickets are. When you're talking about middle class to lower income brackets, this means that these are individuals that cannot make the same kind of calculations because these are things that they may not necessarily afford. At the expense of individuals being able to access the economic market, we don't think that you can just say, just get out of the city, it's a lot easier for you, right? Secondly, we also think that this whole solution of companies will give you homes does not make sense because we don't know in what country or in which part of the world will companies give you homes based on the ability for you to work for their company, right? We think that does not apply to every single individual. Thirdly, do we limit the circulation of cash? Because we say no. We always encourage individuals across all incomes of brackets to have a portfolio of varied investments in terms of where you necessarily invest your money. That's why we give individuals investment tax when they make different investments in different fields. For example, when they invest in property or when they invest in stock markets and many different things. But secondly, closing government will be very happy to support things like progressive taxation in terms of taxing the rich more in terms of the incomes that they accrue, because these are individuals that we think should give back to society socially. We think that individuals within these societies can still have security, because it's quite racist to presume, right, that just because you're below a financial standard that you will always stick a gun out at a person and rob them in their own homes, Mr. Speaker. We think that you can always ensure a level of security for these individuals. No, thank you. Why does the state have a responsibility to implement this model? And we think that this is a characterization that is very important. A, we think that the state has always propagated the concept that real estate is the best kind of investment for individuals to make. And people really buy into this, right? You saw many middle-income individuals subsume into the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008. Irrespective of whether or not individuals can match that mortgage or not, they buy into the idea because the state created the environment that property will always appreciate, and it's a good thing. And they told you in opening opposition, it's unfair on landlords. And we say that that's a good thing, right? Because we say that people can't always investment is always a good thing and say that property will always appreciate. At the very least, when the real estate bubble bursts, individuals are unprepared. Under our side of the house, when you set a maximum rent and say that your benefits don't necessarily accrue to the maximum amount that you perceive that it would do, at least under our side, we say individuals will make better decisions in terms of the investments that they necessarily make. What happens on the status quo right now when you don't have a maximum rent? No, thank you. Firstly, we think it creates an urban sprawl where the economy is primarily concentrated on, especially in urban districts. We're talking about things like the Wall Street districts in New York City or the Toronto financial districts in Canada. And we think that this is where most economic opportunities exist, right? But what happens under our side of the house is that these areas are so attractive, or the prestige of having a place or having a job within the heart of the city is something that people want. But what does this necessarily do when you don't have, or when you create that urban sprawl? Surrounding services become a lot more expensive, right? Things like supermarket have to match up to the prices of the interest within concentrated areas. That means that, for example, Claudine pointed out, if you have a supermarket that if you're in a better area, supermarkets become a lot more expensive to cater to individuals within a particular area. That means that even if you have people who commute into particular areas to work and they want to eat lunch at the supermarket, it becomes a lot more expensive for them to access. Or even when they send their kids to school, for example, the fees are a lot higher because the location is a lot more strategic or a lot more premium, right? But secondly, we also think that the ability for individuals to access economic opportunities is a lot limited, because there is a prestige when you work within the business district that thrives upon the fact that this is an area that is good for you. We also say that states also contribute to this when they denote what are lucrative businesses, because they say that the financial district is the best kind of district to work in because it contributes most to the economy, right? This means that wages within that area increases as well. That means that in that scenario, individuals within the lower income bracket that have a harder ability to access the area, for example, will not be able to access meaningful economic opportunity because individuals within the area always have to have a background of education. That is the trade-off that you make when you get those particular jobs, right? But we also say concentrated economic opportunities limits the ability for people from the middle income or for middle to lower income classes to be able to access. For example, you have many jobs in Shanghai in the financial district, but a lot of people are unable to access because the rise of wages also means that individuals that don't meet the education standard or the financial standard of what is a sound worker does not get the ability to get that as well. And that limits the ability for individuals to be inclusive. But secondly, we also say that it concretizes the distinction of class and race because we have to accept the reality that individuals within lower income brackets are predominantly of a particular race, right? For example, Hispanics or the African Americans in the United States as well as in Canada. We think that in a scenario where you limit the ability for them to access property within urban district, you also create sprawl as well as ghettoization and say that this is the only place that you can access. We think that in this particular scenario, it's very limited as well. Lastly, we also say that development companies always buy lands unnecessarily and make up development properties and overcharge to maximize profits. We think that in this scenario, when you buy multiple lands, it creates a problem for scarcity of land. Under our side of the house, you have more land because the ability for companies to overcharge on those prices means that they cannot accrue the kind of profit that means that they will not take up unnecessary land. We are very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. Call for first speaker, close the session.
Mr. Speaker, the first thing that I like to address from coming from side closing opposition is this assumption that opportunities only exist within urban centers. And this is necessarily not true, because we've seen the trends in anywhere, Mr. Speaker, that there is an incentive for government, there is an incentive for people to expand beyond urban centers, Mr. Speaker. And we tell you that opportunities do exist elsewhere, Mr. Speaker. You don't necessarily have to focus solely onto that. But before anything else, let's go to a few rebuttals coming from side opposition government. They told us, Mr. Speaker, that they are doing this for social good. They are trying to help the poor people. But they did not analyze exactly how a maximum cap can necessarily help these poorer people in terms of obtaining a rent or a place centers, Mr. Speaker. Because if the maximum cap is that, even if the cheapest, if they are poor, Mr. Speaker, the cheapest rent available in the city center will still be too expensive for these poor individuals as well at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker. So at the end of the day, you don't necessarily target or solve the problem per se. You're still allowing them to live off in the ghettos or whatever they say. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we also explain, right, that all city centers have good transport systems. This is an incentive for the state to create one, Mr. Speaker. Even in Malaysia, whereby the private transportation system is not the best, to go into KL, Mr. Speaker, is much easier comparatively going to places like Kajang. So you don't rob the opportunity away. You don't have to take a 2 hours boat ride just to get into KL, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that the paradigm that they paint by traveling every day to work is necessarily a harmful one. But more importantly, the whole idea that you're only focusing towards city centers necessarily sit down, disregard one very important thing, sit down, right? Like you do not focus or refocus your attention towards creating another city center or urban center for your people. Because we tell you, Mr. Speaker, there's a limitations towards how much the city center can cater to the people and to the amount of population that you have in your country. We point to you in examples, for example, right, you have KL within Malaysia, but then you can also create more city centers like Damansara, Subang Jaya, Petaling Jaya, Klang, Mr. Speaker. I don't have American examples because I haven't visited the area yet, right? But the idea is that you can also focus onto those things because we have now places like Damansara Utama where also a lot of opportunities and offices like MIDP, I don't know, which is there, right? So we tell it's not there, sorry, I don't know, somewhere, not in KL, right?
Sorry, I haven't visited that area. Okay, so the idea is that you also focus and you describe. So the idea is that you allow them to have those things there. But more than that, if you're really trying to help the poor people, are you going to concede them to a certain extent because he didn't? That might be. I wanted to ask, going to then implement camping within the urban city center just to help the poor people, because you also need to understand accommodation is not the only problem within the city centers, right? You have things like cost of living, your food, your groceries, and your parking tickets, Mr. Speaker, which can extremely, burn out your pockets at the end of the day. Lastly, is this idea that it's harder. These businesses at the end of the day don't have their minds on their own. They will only focus on city centers. But you also need to, except I'll take you after this, right? Is that businesses also consider things like the comfort and the needs of their employees, and they see which is better for them, for the people and their team as a whole. So if they think that city centers are not necessarily the best place for the employees to get to, Mr. Speaker, they will then operate somewhere else, probably at the outskirts of city centers, whereby the accessibility is much higher, and we don't think that by capping this will necessarily solve the problem at the end of the day. But before that, you have something.
Okay, so basically, you're saying you fundamentally disagree with the fact that people will have additional transportation costs, additional costs of living to try and get to work. If I live in Sarawak, for example, how am I supposed to find a job that only exists in KL?
I promise you, I'll I'll talk about that in my second extension, whereby I talk about the illusion that you're putting on towards people that they are able to afford those areas at the end of the day. But before anything else, let's clarify something, Mr. Speaker. See, if you're having a maximum cap towards the market right now, Mr. Speaker, the same people within that market will still be staying in those areas at the end of the day, meaning to say the rich will still be there, because they are the ones at the end of the day who can afford the rent, Mr. Speaker, and not the poor. So what you're doing is now this. You disallow fresh new demographics of people to have the chance to ever stay in these urban centers at the end of the day. Why this is harmful, Mr. Speaker? Because it's unfair to people who come in late, Mr. Speaker, people like you and me who are just trying out, in the working market, Mr. Speaker, and have the chance to be we don't have the chance to be early towards these city centers. You're favoring the existing population that already exists within this city center. We think it's much worse than that. But secondly, you also prevent or limit the choices of people to choose a more luxurious place for themselves. And we think this is ultimately unfair. If I have the money to purchase a place that's more expensive and more lucrative, Mr. Speaker, a luxurious home, Mr. Speaker, you disallow me or any other individuals the opportunity to spend on the things that they want because of the money that they have. What you're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, is restrict all methods of spending towards these individuals. My two extensions will be on, firstly, how this restricts the luxury housing market from booming, which is extremely important, and secondly, you create an illusion that poor people are able or can afford to stay in those areas. Let's move on to the first extension. The luxury housing market, Mr. Speaker, is extremely lucrative industry that has continuously provided an income towards the country from taxes, because it exists within these city centers, right? So first of all, let's explain. If you have a luxury market, you have better furnitures and more expensive furnitures as well, of higher quality. We tell you this encourages the economy because you can tax these products as well. But more than that, you also encourage small businesses that caters to these needs, like antique markets and special handmade finishes industry, Mr. Speaker. And we tell you this is where you can also gain benefits through that. But secondly, you also attract high-profile investors that are more likely able to afford these places. And we tell you this is a good thing because you cater, or the place caters towards the needs of these special investors, Mr. Speaker. That will directly benefit the city centre due to the influx of new opportunities brought in by these new investors through businesses and investments. And we tell you this is good. But moreover, Mr. Speaker, luxury housing markets is one of the few markets that are generally not affected by any economic turmoil, because there will always be a rich individual who can afford. It might change ownership, Mr. Speaker, but someone will still own it. Meaning to say the market will always be available to provide fund and income towards your economy and can be trusted as a good income source at the end of the day. Juxtapose this, Mr. Speaker, with the market cap. You prevent the luxury market from ever existing, Mr. Speaker, because they cannot sustain or cannot cope with the capping of prices, and it's not profitable to do so. We tell you it's extremely helpful. But on the illusion of the people, right? Because accommodation, like I told you, is not the only thing you need to take into consideration. The cost of living as a whole, such as food and parking and whatnot, right, are expensive compared to rural areas and also urban areas. You are also exposed to the lifestyle and pressured into joining the upper class and their luxurious lifestyle because you stay at those areas. You are more exposed to bars, you're more exposed to hipster cafes, Mr. Speaker, whereby you constantly need to spend your money there. You also allow, Mr. Speaker, the rich to demonize the poor, when they are, because they don't belong there, they're taking away the place at the end of the day. Why is it better now, right now, from our side in status quo? Because you do not coax people through affirmative action and allow them to become complacent with their spending and also their finances. We inform them about their reality and allow them to choose what is best for them, Mr. Speaker. And we tell you this agreement needs to be made and cannot be prevented from that. Because of that, we are very proud to oppose.
Right, thank you very much. To MIDP of government, second speaker, closing government.
Mr. Chair, we think that financial opportunity is definitely larger in the financial district. This can be demonstrated through the better access to resources, better access to economic opportunity, better job opportunity, better education, better facilities, and this goes on and on. So it's an inherent good that most people should be able to access all of these facilities which government push most of their resources to, especially in urban areas. So we'd like to maximize the amount of people that are able to enjoy the amount of enjoyment that can be accessed in urban areas. So what did Jay say to responded to? Jay said that urban sprawl increases living costs because businesses within those areas directly target the rich. Because now urban areas under their paradigm are exclusive to the rich. This increases living costs. This creates a lot of businesses that directly targets the rich. This is weirdly something that what closing opposition wanted, to increase the amount of businesses that directly targets the rich. This is not an inherent good because businesses that directly target the rich only creates opportunities or enjoyment for people of the richer class and people who are only able to access those things. So that means that more antique furniture or more furniture that are more expensive are not an inherent good because now you exclude a large amount of people from being able to access furnitures that are affordable. So we don't see how that's an inherent good on their side. No, thank you. So we also told you that on our side, you increase the ability of large development companies to monopolize industry, to monopolize their ability to create large amount of houses and capitalize on rent. Because we see in large and big urban areas, places like New York, places like Shanghai, large development company monopolizes the amount of land they can have, and then does lead to them capitalizing on the amount of huge amount of rent that they can get back. This is an extremely profitable area for large development companies. So conclusively, the only people that they are able to protect the most are these large development companies, and we don't see an inherent benefit in protecting them. So how are we able to help the poorer and middle income under our side? We say that a max on the rent means that a landlord is not always incentivized to increase the amount of rent they have to specifically target the rich. That means that they can adjust their rent to also target the poor. That means that the max is an affordable amount of money that a common person should be able to access. So at the very least, on our side, you have a diversity of people that are able to access that property and able to access that rent. What you do is this. You create a lot more individuals from middle classes or poorer individuals who are able to stay within urban districts. So on our side, we say that the normalcy of seeing the different amount of people from different social classes in your environment is also an inherent good. Because you don't only see rich individuals walking around in financial district, you're able to see different people from different social classes walking around in the financial district as well. We think that this increases the amount of ability for people to converse within those areas, and the amount reduces the exclusivity between different social classes. We think that exclusivity exists in countries like India and the UAE, in which poorer people and the rich people rarely converse. This reduces the amount of sympathy and empathy towards other issues like financial issues towards the middle income or issues on tax and all those other issues, because there is no inherent coherence between different individuals in different social classes, and we think that's an inherent bad that we wouldn't like to create. It's also something coincidentally what closing opposition wanted to create, an environment of exclusivity. Although we don't understand why a bar is exclusive to a rich individual, but we say that environment of exclusivity is inherently harmful towards the type of conversations you have within a country. Because now you separate and segregate the type of people in the country, and that's extremely harmful towards the discourse within those areas. No, thank you. So the principle on their side is that as long as you provide an alternative, the state has no right to intervene or interfere. We say that you need to evaluate that alternative and evaluate whether or not that alternative is inherently equal to different individuals of different economical class, or is it too unreasonable to expect them to commute from suburban areas to work, because we say that's a horrible disadvantage given the journey they have to go through, the amount of congestion they have to go through. For God's sake, the congestion charges in London was a result of people trying to access financial district in London. So we think that that's extremely bad, because now that you limit their ability to mobilize and limit their ability to elevate their living standard, we think that's like social exclusion at its best, because now they're unable to access all those opportunities. No, thank you. So do job opportunities inherently discriminate people? So we told you already from Jay's speech that not all companies provide accommodation. But we tell you the calculus is this. It's less likely that you'll be able to access the same opportunities if you live in areas or rural areas or suburban areas, because you are inherently less able to access job interviews, less able to always go through and walk in the financial district and know the different opportunities that you have. You're less likely to be attached to a company that will provide you good protection, good tax rebates, and all those amount of things that are only accessible to people in urban areas. Go ahead.
Okay, but you detach these poor people from the reality that they cannot cope with the financial expenses that incur when they stay in those areas. How are you going to cope with that?
We don't think so. What we think is we allow the poorer individuals or the middle class individuals to access the same amount of opportunities rich individuals can have. Doesn't enable them to get out from that cycle of social exclusion. That means that a common middle class individual is now able to elevate his living status and move up the economic hierarchy, as opposed to on their side forever stay within that particular state. The only direct benefit we got from opening opposition is that government, and also closing opposition, is that government gets higher tax. Firstly, we see that there are other means in which government can obtain higher tax. They need to tell us why this is the best way. Secondly, if you are going to meaningfully exclude people from financial opportunities just so you can have enough money to provide them welfare, we say one, that doesn't make sense. And secondly, you spend a lot more money trying to increase the amount of welfare you have to give and increase the amount of money you have to make to redistribute the wealth. Because now what the problem that you have to deal with on their side is a huge income gap between the poor and the rich, and a lack of access to many facilities between the poor and the rich. Comparatively, government spend a lot more money trying to remedy the situation than the little amount of money they can get from taxing the rich, in which we don't think is extremely meaningful. So if you believe in social exclusion is a real problem, you must propose.
Mr. Speaker, as someone who migrated from the deep jungle of Borneo to Kuala Lumpur, I'd love to live in this paradigm that they have created, because it's as if they are capping everything that is expensive in the urban areas. But we think that's very unfeasible for governments to do so. So I think I'll just leave my dream when I'm sleeping, right? So I'm going to talk to you about two issues in this debate. Firstly, how our paradigm will result in better social mobility and economic development. And secondly, how rental price check and balance are better under our paradigm, i.e. the free market rather than their protectionist policy. But before that, a few rebuttals directly towards closing government, sorry. They said that due to increased prices of accommodations, places, only rich people will be able to access these places, and then businesses and services will target these areas because of this lucrative industry. But they don't see the idea that, because you make these places affordable for the poor people doesn't mean doesn't disincentivize the rich people to stay there. And because of that, because of the rich people also staying there, then the cost of living still increases because the businesses will always target this particular area in the first place. That's the free market, that's capitalism, and what's your problem with that, right? Because we think that there's no problem, and I'll talk to you in the sit down. But on the second idea, right, it's very funny that they think that prejudice exists or differences of classes will not exist under their paradigm because the rich and the poor live together in a similar place. And we think that's funny in many ways because we think that prejudice and racism doesn't exist just because you live in the same area, but rather because there are inherent racism in between in some people because of themselves rather than the place where they live in. Sit down. But let's agree to them in some ways, right? But you think that even if you live in a similar place, we don't think suddenly you live in similar classes because we think that, because we think there are different lifestyles that rich people and poor people can afford even if you live in similar places. For example, your clothing, your places you visit, or your friends. Because of these things, we don't think that they are necessarily you will converse with different classes like what dear fairy tale sit down said, right? You think that these are very fluffy coming from their side. Because they also said that there's this extreme characterization. Just because you don't live in a particular area or in the financial district, then you suddenly cannot access these places for job interviews or for any reasons. You can't access these places. We think that's very extreme characterization coming from their side because we think even if you don't live in this particular area, it's fine for you. You can still sit down. I'll tell you in a few minutes. You can still access these places, right? But what have Bloom talked to you in terms of extension? He'll talk to you that their paradigm will create an illusion for the poor that they can afford to live in these high-end places, right? We think that is very detrimental for the economy and also for themselves, especially when they are supposedly fighting for the poor. Because we think that they also agree that public transport can be very expensive, cost of living can be very expensive, and because if you don't cap that, then necessarily the cost of living is also as expensive as it is, and it will cost poor people to even live day by day as if in the status quo, and it doesn't change much, right? But secondly, Bloom also said that it will restrict the market, the luxury market from blooming. This is problematic because in any economic recession, the luxury market is very hard market it's a very good market. It doesn't go down easily because the luxury markets always have demand. I think that restricting this luxury market from blooming will be very problematic for the country, especially when you already cap your profit from tax income because you already cap the profit from that place, right? Jasmine also said that because we already give there's so much poor people, then we will need to give so many welfare programs and everything. But we think that capping the price market is also a form of welfare because government already limit the tax income because rental goes into your income tax, will be taxed in terms of income. So before I move on to my issues, closing.
When you have urban areas targeting exclusively the rich, surrounding services become a lot expensive. Conversely, when you have cap, you reasonably adjust to individuals within that area as well. Under our side, at least we allow people to work in that area to access many different services and jobs.
All right. I think I agree to that particular idea that this will cause a high cost of living. But we think in our paradigm, coming from closing opposition, this will be better because what Loong said, there will be more businesses to go for other places rather than just focusing on the urban area. Because we don't agree that all businesses caters for the high-end market because there's a lot of segments in the market, the low-end market, the middle market, and also the high-end market. And we think that the market price of the increasing rental price causes the real estate investors to develop suburban and rural areas so for a lesser price. This will cause better social mobility because high pricing will not be able to be afforded by most middle income and poor people, right? Because that's why we develop better places, right? And also there are businesses who will follow the money, will follow the population because if you develop certain areas with housing, for example, Nilai and Seremban, businesses go there because they have population there, there are more demands there, people move there, businesses go there, and with this development, with this better social mobility and economic development in this area, it is better to produce, we will have more places to develop. Government doesn't need to intervene much and we still develop certain areas rather than under their paradigm. Because under their paradigm, the development is solely focused on already existing urban areas, that it will be very slow for us to develop other areas, and there's no incentives for private companies or even businesses to develop suburban areas or rural areas, because we think under our paradigm is far much better. But the second issue is rental price check and balance are better under our paradigm, because if you have a max cap price, then most, if not all, landlord will put the rental price at that maximum price, because hey, everyone is putting at that particular price, right? But under our paradigm, under free market, the price will be regulated via supply and demand, because in terms of rental, it is an agreement between the landlord and also the person who want to rent, and there's a sort of agreement, right? Because if you don't think that particular price or that particular rental fee is acceptable, and you can just reject that. And if there are many people who reject that, then there's no demand for that, then the particular price will drop. That's how real estate works. Just because people will eventually lower their prices if there's no demand for that for those type of places. So what have I talked to you about? I've talked to you about our extensions, how it will create illusions for the poor that they can afford living in the city, and how it is very detrimental. Also, I'll talk to you about how it will restrict the luxury market from blooming, and it's very bad for the economy. For all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vijay. For the floor, shake hands. Give some time.
Stop it, stop.